New York City, April 19th, 1989. The city that never sleeps was settling into another spring night. In Central Park, runners traced quiet paths beneath the dim glow of street lamps. Cyclists moved through winding trails. Groups of teenagers laughed and shouted across the grass. To most people, it was just another evening. But before sunrise, something would happen that would ignite one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. A case that would divide a nation. A case that would raise uncomfortable questions about confession, evidence, and the fragile line between certainty and truth. Because on that night, a brutal crime would occur. And within days, 5 teenagers would confess to it. But years later, a single piece of evidence would expose a chilling possibility. What if those confessions were never true? Shortly after 1:30 in the morning, police officers searching the northern edge of Central Park made a discovery that would shock the entire city. A young woman lay in the brush, barely alive. She had been brutally assaulted. Her skull fractured. Her body so severely injured that doctors initially believed she might not survive. The victim was a 28-year-old investment banker who had gone jogging earlier that evening. For weeks, the public would know her only by one name: the Central Park jogger. The attack seemed random, savage, unexplainable. And in a city already struggling with crime, the incident struck directly at a deeper fear, the idea that nowhere was safe. But what investigators didn't yet know was that the search for answers would soon move faster than the evidence itself. That same night, police had already detained several teenagers inside the park. They were part of a larger group that had been moving through the area earlier in the evening. Witnesses reported minor disturbances, arguments, some harassment of cyclists and joggers. Nothing close to the brutality of the assault that had just occurred. But in high-pressure investigations, proximity can quickly become suspicion. And suspicion can quickly become certainty. 5 teenagers soon became the focus of the investigation. Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Yusef Salam, and Corey Wise. They were between 14 and 16 years old. Still children in the eyes of the law. Yet within hours, they would enter interrogation rooms that few adults ever navigate successfully. And what happened inside those rooms would change everything. The questioning began late in the evening and continued through the night. Some sessions lasted more than 10 hours. The teenagers were separated. Some had parents present for portions of the questioning. Others did not. Fatigue set in quickly. Teenagers who had been awake all day suddenly found themselves under bright lights, facing trained detectives demanding answers. Detectives insisted they already knew what had happened. They suggested details. They corrected timelines. They implied the other boys had already confessed. Over time, the pressure mounted. And slowly, the impossible began to happen. The teenagers started telling investigators what they believed the investigators wanted to hear. At first, the statements were vague, then more specific. Eventually, the confessions were recorded on video. 5 teenagers, 5 confessions, 5 admissions that appeared to solve the crime. But there was a problem. The confessions didn't match each other. Not even close. One boy said he held the victim down. Another said he only watched. A third claimed he struck her. A fourth placed himself somewhere else entirely. The details shifted constantly. The timeline changed. The sequence of events rarely aligned. Yet investigators believed they had solved the case. Because despite the contradictions, one fact remained consistent. Each boy admitted involvement. And in the public eye, that was enough. The narrative solidified almost overnight. 5 teenagers had attacked a jogger in Central Park. The city demanded justice. And justice, it seemed, had arrived quickly. But beneath the surface, something crucial was missing. Investigators collected extensive physical evidence from the crime scene. Hair samples fibers. Biological material. At the time, DNA testing was still in its infancy, but it had already begun transforming forensic science. And in this case, the results would prove significant. The DNA recovered from the victim was tested, then compared to the 5 suspects. The outcome should have changed everything. None of the DNA matched any of them, not one. The physical evidence pointed somewhere else. Somewhere unknown. But prosecutors argued that the teenagers had still participated in the assault, even if the biological evidence didn't place them directly at the scene. They insisted the confessions were the strongest evidence, and jurors would soon hear those confessions for themselves. The trials began in 1990. Prosecutors presented videotaped confessions to the jury, each teenager describing parts of the attack, each statement appearing to confirm the others. But defense attorneys pointed out the inconsistencies. The timelines didn't match. Descriptions of the crime conflicted. Physical evidence failed to connect the boys to the scene. Still, the emotional gravity of the case weighed heavily on the courtroom. The victim had survived, but barely. Her injuries were devastating. Jurors listened carefully, and ultimately they delivered their verdicts guilty. The teenagers were convicted of assault, rape, and other charges. They received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years in prison. For the justice system, the case was over. But for the truth, it was just beginning. The boys entered prison as teenagers and emerged years later as adults. But their convictions remained. The case remained closed. The confessions remained accepted. And the city moved on. Until something unexpected happened more than a decade later. Inside a prison cell, a man approached investigators with a confession of his own. The man's name was Matias Reyes. He was already serving a life sentence for multiple violent crimes. And he had something to say. Reyes claimed he had attacked the jogger in Central Park alone. At first, investigators were skeptical. But his account contained details that had never been made public. Details about the location, the sequence of events, the brutality of the attack. There was only one way to verify the story. DNA testing. The biological evidence from the original investigation still existed. When scientists tested it against Reyes' DNA profile, the result was immediate. A perfect match. The same DNA recovered from the victim in 1989. Forensic evidence now pointed to one man. And one man only. Not 5 teenagers. Not a group attack. Just one perpetrator. The revelation forced prosecutors to reconsider everything. In 2002, the New York District Attorney's Office made a dramatic decision. The convictions of the 5 men were vacated. 13 years after their arrests, the justice system acknowledged that the case had been wrong. The confessions once presented as powerful evidence were now recognized as deeply unreliable. The 5 teenagers were finally cleared. But the damage had already been done. Years of their lives had been lost to a narrative that turned out to be false. Today, the case is studied extensively by psychologists and legal scholars. Researchers have documented how vulnerable young suspects can be during prolonged interrogations, particularly teenagers. Factors such as fatigue, authority pressure, and isolation can influence memory and perception. In some cases, suspects begin to internalize suggestions offered by investigators. They may eventually repeat those suggestions as if they were memories, not because they intend to lie, but because the environment reshapes their understanding of events. What began as confusion becomes narrative. A narrative becomes evidence. But perhaps the most unsettling part of the story isn't the confession, or the trial, or even the wrongful conviction. It's this. The DNA evidence that ultimately revealed the truth had existed from the beginning. The physical evidence never changed. It always pointed away from the teenagers. But the narrative of the case moved faster than the science. And once that narrative took hold, it became extraordinarily difficult to reverse. The attack in Central Park remains one of the most haunting crimes in modern American history. A woman nearly lost her life. 5 teenagers lost years of theirs. And the justice system confronted an uncomfortable truth about certainty. Confessions can be powerful, but they are not infallible. Evidence must speak louder than narrative. Because when investigations begin with assumptions, they often end by confirming them. The story of the Central Park Five is not just about a crime in a park. It is about the psychology of belief, about how pressure, fear, and expectation can reshape reality, and about how the truth sometimes waits patiently, buried beneath certainty, until someone is willing to look again. This has been Chronicles of Clues, where the evidence never lies. But sometimes it takes years for someone to listen.